All right, good morning, good afternoon, folks. Great to have you all here with us. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our guest speaker today. So today in Building for Growth, one of the things that we want to talk about are 5 common mistakes that nonprofits make with data and how to avoid them, really trying to understand how research plays a key and critical role into what we do as nonprofits, how we understand our effectiveness, how we could improve our impact, how we can really have an accurate picture of who we are as an organization. And to do that, I get to introduce Ali, who most everybody knows here because she is part of the La Piana team and has been the lead in this Building for Growth initiative. And while we all know her as Ali, technically, we should know her as Dr. Corella. Ali has a PhD, has an extensive background in research and really understanding impact, effectiveness, evidence-based learning. She was previously at Heartland Alliance and has an extensive background in how nonprofits can really use data. And so I personally am grateful for Ali because I've learned a lot since the time that we started working together in terms of how to really score qualitative research and be able to make most sense of the data that's kind of a short answer or a conversation. How do I take that and make it into quantifiable metrics that I can use? She has taught me how to tag things, how to arrange surveys in a way that makes most sensible. And so words that I often hear from Ali are evidence-based, research with a lowercase r, data informed. And so I think that you guys will likely hear a lot of the same words. Excited to hear all the wisdom that Ali has to share and grateful to be able to introduce a friend into this conversation. So with that, I'll pass it off to Ali for her wonderful talk.
Thank you so much, Umberto. Thank you for everyone joining us today. Again, take a moment to look at all of the great organizations that are here and that make up our cohort for Building for Growth. We are really happy to share space with you all, to provide support with you in this kind of pure learning environment. This is our second to last workshop for year one. And many of you may have heard we're able to extend this program for an additional year, which we're so excited about. In year two, we will be tackling much of these topics in a deeper manner, and we'll kind of send more information on that as it becomes available. Looks like people are kind of slowly joining us today, so we have some rolling admission here. I do want to take a moment before we get started to change the tone for a moment and to create space to acknowledge the trauma we are carrying as we enter today's conversation. So given the elementary school shooting that took place yesterday in Texas, as well as the recent horrific acts of violence in Buffalo, and to add to this pain, today is also the second anniversary of George Floyd's murder. So it may feel as though some things have changed for the better, but we still have a very long way to go. We aren't just tired, we're exhausted, we're in pain, we're angry. If you're like me, you're sad. We're also doing our best. I'm not going to talk about thoughts and prayers. I know those of you in the room today, you're doers, you're changing policies, you're part of the solution, but it's heavy. And some days like today, it's hard to show up to work. So I want to thank you for showing up today. And if you need to be off camera or something, I totally get it. Also, I know you don't need my permission, but in an effort just to over communicate here, if you just need to log off and crawl under the covers, that's fine too. We're going to record the workshop and it will be available to you to view at any point. We'll put it on our website and we'll email it out to everyone as well. So I just wanted to say I'm grateful to be here with you. And for those of us who need a break from the news, I'm hopeful that the next hour or so that we spend together can offer a space for peer support and learning. And, as always, kind of feel free to communicate with one another in the chat as well. At this moment, if you could please post your organization, your name, and maybe even your location in the chat. And throughout today's workshop, please utilize the raise hand function and post your questions in the chat. I will always monitor the chat as best as I can. Sometimes it's a little bit confusing for me to do everything at once. So I will just say that I'm not always the best at that, but I will try to do as best as I can. In my opinion, one of the kind of most important aspects of these workshops is just being able to share experiences with others. This feeling that like you're not alone in the challenges that you're facing as a growing organization. So please try to take what I'll be discussing today and view it through the lens of your organization. I really want you to think about what resonates with you. I want you to take notes on things that are pressing. I'll share the slides with you too, but sometimes just jotting down 1 or 2 ideas will help you retain some of the information. And in order to get the most out of the workshop, please do your best to be an active listener and also contribute your ideas to make the conversation more rich. I do want today to be a bit more interactive. So we'll have a variety of opportunities to kind of unmute ourselves and unpack some of these ideas. If it's helpful for you, like I know for me, sometimes I'm so worried I'm going to forget what I say that if I don't jot it down somewhere, I can't listen to the next thing that's happening. So if that's the way that you learn, feel free to jot an idea down in chat and we can kind of address those ideas when we do have those opportunities to unmute and talk about things. So you've seen this slide a lot. It names the main findings that surface throughout our data collection from those, all 30 organizations participating in this program. We organized the largest identified challenges into the 2 groups, which you see here, staff and systems. We've been touching on each of these topics throughout all of the workshops, also in the communities of practice. And next year, we'll continue to kind of unpack these ideas even more. Today's workshop isn't like an individual bullet point itself. We didn't have a specific finding around evaluation, rather evaluation and kind of data showed up in a lot of different areas. So I just highlighted and read some of the spaces that I think lend themselves well to this conversation that we'll be having today. That's so funny, Umberto, that you said one thing that I say a lot is not capital R research, because I'm going to say something about that right now. We're not talking about capital R research. We're not doing any large studies here. We're talking about how we can use data or information to make smarter decisions and how we can collect that information in a way that is easier, less of a burden, in a way that is ethical and equitable. And importantly, how we can start building these practices of data-informed decision-making into our ways of doing business. So the current workshop will unpack the 5 mistakes that are listed here on the right. So this includes like the inaccuracy of outcomes reporting, inequitable data collection, underuse and over collection of data, data security, and also lack of collaboration. As I mentioned, we are going to be having a lot of opportunities for you all to talk today as well. So the way that I built this out is I'm going to kind of hear some signs that your organization might be experiencing challenges with these mistakes, with each of these 5 areas, and then I'll offer some tips. I will offer resources for each of these 5 in case one of these are something you need to hit the ground running on tomorrow. And then at maybe 3 different points throughout today, we'll also kind of just talk about your experience with these challenges and how you approach them in your own organization. As always, we do these learning goals at the beginning as well. Today, I'm really just trying to offer tips on these 5 areas. And at the end of the session, we will assess the extent to which I was successful in doing that and how you're kind of walking away from the conversation today. So let's kick off the workshop with an opening poll. Brenda's helping me with polls today. You can see it was just launched. We have 3 questions. This poll is confidential. We are looking for as close to 100% response rate as possible. I will stop talking now so that you can complete the poll and just be as honest as you can. I can kind of just verbally walk us through it. So we have 77% of people that participated, which is a good number. The first question was about whether or not people have in-house research or evaluation teams. We only have 1 organization on the call who answered yes to that, which is pretty much in line with typical non-for-profits. So I will be interested for that one person to kind of have your unique viewpoint throughout this process in terms of the role and the way that you approach evaluation in your organization. For question 2, on a scale of 1 to 5, let's answer some of these questions. So I feel really confident that we are measuring and reporting on outcomes in a reliable manner. We had almost everyone disagreeing or strongly disagreeing. We had only 7% of the people actually agreed with that statement. Again, I really appreciate your honesty, and I think that's exactly right. I've been involved in outcomes reporting for a number of years, and my head spins at some of the ways that organizations kind of land on these numbers. Once you kind of lift up the hood and you see it, it's tricky. It's tricky to unforget. The next question is, my organization has had conversations about what equitable data collection and analysis look like. We have 27% of people agreeing or strongly agreeing with that statement. Everyone else is either neutral or disagreeing. That's something that we'll talk more about today as well. Great. I just want to say this first slide, these first 2 slides, I have a lot of text on them. I wanted to build this out as a resource that you can use. You can walk away with some of these checklists. So I'll just say, like, this first mistake in general, we're going to be spending a good deal of time on. So many organizations scramble at the end of the year to estimate their impact, knowing in their gut that the data isn't accurate. We just saw that in your poll. As an applied researcher who has worked in nonprofits for over a decade, I know this reality all too well. Sometimes the scramble is because you are being asked to report on something new or unexpected. Sometimes it's because you've implemented a new way of collecting data, or maybe you're dealing with turnover and kind of a loss of institutional knowledge, or more often than not, failure of staff to just report the data on time. So regardless of why, the scramble is exhausting, and it doesn't feel good to share data that you don't feel confident in. So here is a very incomplete list of signs that your organization might be facing this mistake. So let me just walk through this slide with you. So signs your organization might be making this mistake with outcomes and impact reporting being inaccurate. The end of the year reporting feels like a scramble. It feels like chaos, because it is chaos. You can only offer ranges of numbers served. You say words like at least or as many as. Your outcomes data isn't showing the change you hoped for. You don't know if your outcomes are good or bad. You have nothing to compare it to. You don't know if 50 people having changes this year is good, because you don't know how many people did last year. You don't know what percentage that is of all the people you serve, things like that. The way that you approach your report writing changes. You don't have like a protocol in place. You don't have a dedicated staff member whose primary role includes evaluation and analysis. You do not have a theory of change. You do not have a data dictionary. You do not use a data management system. And by this, it could be something like Salesforce, like a CMS, a CRM, could be a donor database, some tool that you're using to manage your data. Or, which is also very common, you do have a system, but data is just not entered correctly, or maybe it's a new system and people are really struggling to kind of grasp how to utilize it. And you do not have common data elements that are collected for each program, department, or unit. So let's keep moving and kind of unpack how to, if any of those signs resonate with you, let's talk about some tips of how to address them. As I said, I'm going to spend a good amount of time on this slide. And then this is an opportunity after I talk for a little bit. I want everyone to just kind of unmute themselves and share your own experiences with this. So as I'm talking, try to think about how this is showing up in your organization. Let's talk about how to increase the reliability of your outcomes and impact reporting. So the recommendations here I broke up into 3 groups. First is getting organized. Next is making sure data collection and analysis is ongoing. And third is just being purposeful. So first and foremost, being organized is key. On the more formal end of the spectrum here, you may have a full data governance committee. Sorry, I just clicked on the wrong thing. That leads the organization's efforts with data, but more realistically, and I'm going to bet for the most of us in the room here, there's just a small group of people, or maybe like 1 or 2 people that's kind of tasked with organizing your data at the organizational level. One of the easiest things you can do to increase the reliability of reporting is to develop a data dictionary. I've had multiple organizational leaders come to me and say something like, Allie, I just want to be able to say the number of participants that we served in our departments this year. And that seems like a really easy request, but there are so many assumptions in that ask. And with assumptions come huge and inconsistent reporting errors. So in this example, my follow-up question would be, well, how do you define a participant? Is it someone who shows up once, or someone who has been engaged in programming or a grantee for 10 consecutive years? How do you define served? What is the dosage of service you're counting here? When you say department, how do you define departments? Do data collection tools include those same groupings? Do programs in that department collect data in that same way? Do you have access to that data? So you can see, and those are just some of the questions I would ask. Like, a really simple question gets complicated so quickly without data, without clarity in the definitions of your terms. So a data dictionary doesn't have to be a huge undertaking. It's really quite easy. You literally just write down the most commonly used terms for your organizations. You get a group together to define them, and then you use those definitions consistently, both internally and externally. You make the resource accessible. You point people to it often. Think about how you use that language in your website and your marketing, as well as internally to your organization. Some terms that I would recommend including in a data dictionary are like your demographic terms, anything about how you talk about adult or youth or geographic regions, or if you are a direct service provider, like what is your definition of supportive housing, for instance, and how does it vary from the way it's talked about in the sector? So the data dictionary can inform both how data is collected, but also how it's reported. It saves so much time. And although we know we can't eliminate bias, it's a really easy way to help reduce bias and just kind of get you organized and level set. Secondly, kind of within this first bucket of recommendations here, consider developing a theory of change. It is important for all staff to know how the activities they are engaged in daily advance the mission of the organization. So everyone should know what success looks like and what the goal of their work is. A theory of change and associated logic model is a really straightforward way to accomplish this. Theories of change are also great for proposals. They're really critical for onboarding new staff. They help with level setting, with new program design, and much more. In the next slide here, I'll include a link of a theory of change link that can help you kind of build out that logic model if you haven't done so already. The third tip of how to get organized is to formalize your intake with a set of common data elements across the organization. So I'm going to give you 2 examples here. Let's call Organization A and Organization B. So Organization A is an alliance. They provide, they serve like a variety of issue areas. Let's say everything from immigration to housing to health. The beneficiaries are people living in poverty. So as we know, with kind of this holistic service provision and these wraparound services, that helps people achieve outcomes faster. Even if someone is in maybe an employment program, they still may have a mental health need or housing services. So why not have intake have a way to capture all of the participants' needs? Doing so reduces the burden on the participant of having to repeat information over and over again. And it could also help the organization have easier processes in place for referrals or for placement based on need. So of course, like this type of organized intake also leads to easier reporting. So that was kind of our first example. Let's talk about another example here, Organization B. They provide funds to community health organizations. An intake for this might include collecting standard information set at the start of the engagement, like just a list of check boxes that they have to check that allow you to start categorizing those grantees into things like regions or what types of health services they provide, like are they doing reproductive health, cognitive behavioral therapy, etc. It could also have a space for what are your target beneficiaries, what is your geographic region of service. The point here is that your reporting will only be as good as the data that you have to work with. So at a previous job, I worked closely with an IT department who always said, garbage in, garbage out, right? There are a lot of easy ways to get organized on the front end to inform data reporting on the back end. Let's move into the next recommendation now. Make sure data collection and analysis is ongoing. It's not something that happens once a year. It is consistently happening. So determine leads for outcomes reporting. Write this into the job description. Prioritize it. Build in monthly or quarterly checks on outcomes data. This can either be like a special meeting just on outcomes, or what I recommend and I actually like better is to just have a reoccurring agenda item on existing quarterly meetings that force you to kind of talk about data and outcomes. If you dedicate time to your data will get stronger. Build in a data checking protocol. You should never be reporting on data that only one person has been involved in the analysis. Okay, so let's just pause here. If you are doing that now, pause, pivot, make sure that someone else is checking that data. Errors happen. Data checking is really important and it's often overlooked. If you're using a data management system, there are like a lot of easy quality reports you can run as well, where errors in the data, you can kind of type in what type of errors you're searching for, and then the tool itself will identify those errors and will even shoot like an automatic message to whoever inputted that data and say like, you have 48 hours, please fix this data. Because what happens so often is we get to the point of reporting and we start doing analysis. And then at that point, we realize that the data we have is full of errors. So rather than waiting for that, which will like make us late on writing the report, have those constant checks of making sure that the data coming in is clean and that it's been checked. So the first hurdle is really just getting people to enter data. This is an ask on top of everyone's busy schedules. The second hurdle is making sure it's entered correctly. It will not always be entered correctly. For anyone who's utilizing Salesforce or some other database, you know that. So the third hurdle is making sure those errors get fixed. And finally, the goal is being able to use some of that information to understand something better or to make a decision about something. The final recommendation here to increase outcomes and impact reporting is to be purposeful. Again, a lot of tips here just involve creating space to get organized. This can include developing a reporting protocol with a list of steps for how to write reports so turnover isn't a challenge. I've certainly been in organizations where like a critical person leaves and with them so much knowledge leaves and we have to kind of reinvent the wheel. Another tip is to set targets. There is not much of a point of collecting and reporting on outcomes if you don't know what your target is and what you're actually working towards. So think about like, what are the industry standards? How are other organizations doing this? A fun fact, if you are using Salesforce, they have something called Einstein Analytics that you can use to view external outcomes data. And that can help you set some targets. I think it's an add-on, but it could be worth it if that's something you're interested in. Be purposeful when defining success. Be open to this definition evolving, and always include beneficiaries in the conversation of defining success. Lastly, do not overstate findings. I build in a slide to every slide deck I create that includes a description of how the data in this deck should and should not be used, right? So once we call something a finding, like it just develops legs of its own and people say, well, research says blah, blah, blah. And they take that information and they give it maybe more value or strength than we believe it's worth. So it is critically important to include like a kind of a caveat slide anytime you're presenting data to say like, this is the way I want you to receive this information. it was a limited sample and so on and so forth. Again, most of the times, unless we are doing have a real research team in place, most of this is not capital R research, to Umberto's earlier point. Okay, I just threw a lot at you. I would like now for us to kind of just talk about this for a little bit. Does any of this resonate with you? Do you have reactions to anything I just shared? Have you tried any of these suggestions? Could you see yourself implementing any of these suggestions? Let's just kind of open it up for conversation now. Thank you. So here are a bunch of resources on how to kind of increase reliability of outcomes and impact reporting and evaluation. So we'll share all of these slides with you. We'll also put the slides and the recording on our website. But if this was a particular thing that resonates with you, here are some resources to unpack it a bit more. I'm going to keep moving. So mistake number 2, data is not collected in an equitable manner. Nonprofits often collect the same data year after year without getting consent or evaluating whether their collection methods are equitable. If your organization is committed to equity, this commitment includes the way you collect and talk about data. So some signs your organization may be making this mistake are here on the screen. So your commitment to DEI does not include recommendations for data collection, analysis, or sharing. You do not disaggregate your findings by variables such as race, ethnicity, or gender. You collect a lot of data, but you fail to re-engage people from whom information was extracted. You collect information you are knowingly unable to act on. You analyze data without context. You have not engaged beneficiaries in conversations about needs and how they characterize success. You provide recommendations without a deep understanding of potential roadblocks or historical attempts of solving the same problem. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. It's just kind of some signs that you might be experiencing at this challenge. So I touched on this in the previous section, but it's so important, I'm going to repeat it. Equity involves power. So think about who is and who isn't in the room when outcomes are defined and when findings are surfaced. Be equitable in your data collection by utilizing things like participant advisory councils, or regular advisory councils, town halls, focus groups, surveys, any other kind of group or tool that you can touch into at multiple points throughout the process of collecting and analyzing data. Do not just extract information from your beneficiaries with no follow-up. On the next slide, one of the resources from Chicago Beyond is called Why Am I Always Being Researched? And it's a really good example of how we ask of the community, we pull information, and then we use that information to come up with ideas, but we don't re-engage the people that we took that information from. And sometimes we really miss the mark, and how damaging perpetuating that cycle is. So it's just a great resource I recommend that I'll share on the next slide. Importantly, pull from existing data whenever you can to reduce the burden on your beneficiaries, and so as not to kind of perpetuate those massive inequities and the power dynamics that have shaped the history of research in America. Secondly, collect data with transparency. Always state at the time of collection what you are collecting, why, and what you plan to do with the data. If you're a direct service provider, you're going to need to include informed consent at intake. You'll also want to develop like a unique participant ID to retain confidentiality. If you're HIPAA compliant, of course, there are a variety of other things that you need to be aware of. Pause and ask yourself why you're collecting information, and then make sure you're collecting information also at the right time. So if you're a direct service provider trying to understand like the extent to which your services are changing someone's lives, and your services include something like mental health, you're going to need to develop trust before you have those kind of intake conversations about where someone's at in terms of their mental health, right? So you wouldn't want to ask that right at the beginning of the engagement, even if it is kind of your first piece of data collection. So maybe you have an intake, and then maybe after you get to know the person for a while, you actually ask some of those kind of pre-assessment questions. If you provide funds for organizations to create impact in their communities, you'll want to be very aware of the power dynamics and be careful with what you're asking to be reported to you, and that this is approached in an equitable and transparent manner. So I'm working with an organization now, for instance, that has made a commitment to equity. And so when they ask their grantees about the way in which equity is prioritized in their work, they're framing this as a condition of the application. They're being transparent about their intention to fund organizations who have an equitable approach to their work. One more anecdote I'll share here that has come up. I think my colleagues have probably heard me mention this before, as well as I know we talked about it in the evaluation community of practice, is to be transparent about why you're gathering information. So many years ago, I was involved in a focus group here in Chicago with, it was a re-entry for returning citizens program. I was very early in my career then. I was taking notes. I was not the facilitator of the focus group. But in the focus group, the participants were never told the purpose of the focus group, which was really to learn about workforce development needs. So this other need of housing came up, a very vital need. And a lot of time was spent in about how many of the men were living in cars or crashing on couches or just homeless and living in shelters, and how that need was clearly a priority over going into some kind of job training program. We talked about it so much that at the end of the focus group, some of the men thought we were actually going to help them get housed. When they learned that we weren't actually there to talk about housing, they were upset. They felt like we had completely wasted their time. And to be fair, we had. This leads us to our third recommendation here of not only being transparent about why you are collecting information, but also being transparent about what you're able to do and not do with the information that you collect. So this comes up in staff satisfaction surveys a lot as well, where staff feel like their needs are not being met. So in many cases, leadership does change based on what they learned, but they just forget to tell staff to close the loop there. They forget to say, based on your feedback, we made this change. We heard you. They do the thing, but they don't tell the people. So the people don't know that the thing is related to what they said. More often than not, there's a reason why a staff suggestion can't be implemented. But rather than explaining that the recommendation is just not addressed, and then people don't feel heard. So part of the reason that people don't want to fill out surveys or participate in focus groups is because they feel like their input won't be heard, or that it's just kind of the organization checking it off to say that they did it without a real intention of making changes based off of what was learned. Additional considerations for equitable data collection include having conversations about the burden and unintentional harm associated with data collection, clarifying which data you only need to collect once. There's nothing more infuriating than asking the same person the same thing multiple times. Just ask them once. You get organized on your end to reduce the burden on their end. Take into context and consideration, like when you're collecting information as well. So by that, I mean, if you're providing services to someone with PTSD, you're not going to want to have a lot of triggers in the intake process that could potentially re-traumatize someone without having counseling services available directly after that intake, and or just giving them a heads up about what they're going to be asked about so they're not caught off guard. Again, you're also not going to want to be asking for this information until you've built some trust. So for the sake of time, we're going to keep moving. But if there's anything your organization has done to try to address equity in data collection, go ahead and drop it in the chat and we can stay engaged that way. Oops. Okay. Here are some resources on equitable data collection. Time here. So mistake number 3, you're sitting on a mountain of data that you don't use. It's incredibly common for nonprofits to rely on external data rather than their own organizational data to inform decision-making. There's nothing wrong with that. But if there are things you could do in-house, why not do it? It's even more common for data to be left out of the decision-making altogether. And of course, that's something that I don't like to see. So here are some signs that you're sitting on what I like to call a mountain of data that you don't use. You haven't audited your data to see what you're using and what you're not using. Your historical data is stored for compliance, but never used for decision-making. You do use data in meetings. You do not use data in meetings. You only use it for reports. You add new data elements to collect without removing old. You have been collecting the same data for many years without stopping to ask what you intend to do with the data and why you need to collect it. The amount of information that you ask beneficiaries to fill out or share is overwhelming. It takes a long time. or you only rely on external data from other organizations to help you stay up to date with what's happening in the field. You're not able to look at your own in-house data to help you understand trends in the field. So if your organization has been around for more than a couple of years, you're likely collecting some data that you don't use or that you don't need. So many organizations collect data for external reasons, such as compliance or reporting to funders. When grants or funds change, these data collection practices may not. What happens is with each new contract, you just collect more data in addition to the data you're already collecting. So this may mean you're collecting the same data more than once. That's another way to kind of increase the burden on participants and staff. More likely than not, there is a lot of data that you have access to that just sits there, isn't used to inform your ways of doing business in any way. This is a huge missed opportunity, and it's super common in nonprofits. We also know data collection may feel like an extra burden on top of an already full plate. So if we're going to ask staff to collect data, we have to know why we are asking them to collect it and have a real clear plan of how we're going to use it. That will help with buy-in of getting that data in without errors. The easiest way to stay on top of this is just to start with a simple data audit. Take a look at all the data you collect, map it to what you're using. Then for all of the data that isn't being used and that you don't need for compliance or existing reporting, ask if it's useful to you. If the answer is no, simply stop collecting it. Before you do this, ask yourself, what else could this data teach me? So I believe my colleague Anuka is on the call today, but him and I were having a conversation the other day about a client he's working with. And I just felt like this was a good anecdote. So they're trying to get a better grasp on organizational culture. And then before creating a new survey on organizational culture, though, we asked what existing data they have that can help inform an understanding of the organizational culture. So maybe they have, after a quick review of their HR data, they can look at things like turnover and retention. Maybe they could also pull from a staff satisfaction survey or a well-being survey. And those things can help paint a decent picture of where the organization is in terms of culture. So now, rather than just collect information that they already have, they can be more targeted in their outreach, which saves time for staff and for leadership. Anytime that you have a question about your organization, your first instinct may be to collect information to answer the question. So I'm going to push you on that and try to encourage you to have your first step be to find existing data. So only after you look through your existing data should you look to fill in gaps in knowledge. Okay, so I don't know, this is maybe a specific reference. I don't know if any of you have been binging The Home Edit on Netflix or any of Marie Kondo's show. This may speak a little bit more to my personal interest of organization, but the same principles apply to data. So start with an edit, and then you organize things into categories, and then you can see more clearly where you have gaps. Another note on retiring data is come up with a plan for archives and historical data, because many contracts will require you to keep data for like a certain number of years. So you don't want to get rid of data unless you're at the point that you can archive it. So next, examine popular data sources. This is just another reminder to categorize what you've started to edit down. What are the most popular sources of data that inform your report writing, or more importantly, your decision making? If you have some intake forms that take a long time and really don't inform anything, it may be an indication that you can either cut that intake form down or archive it altogether. Or if you find yourself constantly relying on external data to help you think about your work, consider whether you could collect similar variables to help you better understand your own beneficiaries in your own organization. Lastly, and importantly, try to build data use into the ways of doing business. This is not different than the conversations we've had about DEI. And by that, I mean, like, first, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we saw a lot of organizations developing like a task force or a special interest group. We know that may be a start, but the real goal is to build this into the DNA of your organization. The same things happens with data. We have a couple people thinking about data. We don't really have it built into the DNA of the organization. The only way to do this is with effective change management and constantly prioritizing the effort. Evidence-based decision-making, another word that Humberto said I'd probably say a lot today, and he's absolutely right. It sounds like a huge undertaking. It's really just a small paradigm shift. So instead of relying solely on anecdotes, start using data in your meetings. Model this for others. Prompt your teams to use evidence to support their suggestions. One way that I used to do this when I was director of quality management at a nonprofit here in Chicago was I built in a reoccurring agenda item at every director's meeting. And I required directors to pull a report from Salesforce on the topic they were discussing and to utilize the data to help support the conversation. They did not like this. They hated this. There was a lot of pushback to this ask, but I stuck with it. Over the months, the directors started to see how relying on their own data really did help them make data-informed decisions. And the small tweaks to service, which were made as a result, had lasting impact. We also saw a lot less data errors coming in to our Salesforce as well. One small tweak you can make is called PDSA cycle. I'll include a resource on the next slide. It stands for Plan, Do, Study, Act. So again, this term evidence-based decision-making garners images of like a huge research intervention, and that's just not the case. You can use evidence or data to make decisions in really small ways, and often that's where I suggest you start. So here's another example. I helped an organization conduct a participant satisfaction survey. Participants had a lot of suggestions about how programming could be improved. Their responses for one question on the staff satisfaction survey talked about the extent to which participants were taking advantage of the services offered to them, and if they were the right services, what the organization could do differently. So for one of the programs, the finding was that participants really didn't know the full list of services that were available to them. So we came up with what we call a small test of change in this PDSA cycle. So we came up with a plan. That's the P. It was a small plan. It sounds really silly and obvious, but here it is. The plan was to make the very small change of making the existing services more visible. So for the do, the D in the PDSA, we printed out the list of services, we translated it into a lot of languages, and we turned it into a giant poster, and we hung it in the entryway of the program so that all participants would see it when they entered the building. Then the following year, we didn't make any other change. We just posted it. Then the following year in the participant satisfaction survey for the same question, the S in the PDSA cycle, which stands for study, we asked the same question about services offered, and findings show a very different result. People knew what services were offered because they saw it every day when they walked in. So not only did they know about those services, but they were also taking advantage of more services than before. So now that we have confirmed that the study worked, which was, we essentially piloted that simple poster in one program, we just scaled that. And we started utilizing similar posters in other programs as well. And over time, we saw more and more participants engaging in services. So the point here is that a really small test of change can have lasting impact, and using data to address a problem can also be really empowering. I know I'm pulling some examples of direct service organizations here, but there's also plenty of organizations on the call who are not direct service providers. I just want you to know that these same recommendations are in place. Okay, we're going to keep moving for the sake of time, but if there are small ways, small changes you've made based off of information you've gathered, please drop it in the chat now. And as I mentioned, here are some resources on data-informed decision-making. And if you're interested in learning more about the PDSA cycle, that's in here as well. So mistake 4, you are at risk for sharing confidential information. With so many people working remotely, the risk of sharing confidential information is higher than it's ever been before. So do not wait until it's too late to create protocol protecting staff, funder, member, grantee, and participant information. Here are some signs your organization may be at risk for sharing confidential information. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some things to look for. You do not have data consent forms. You use personal computers or cell phones to do your work. You have remote staff. You don't have a VPN. You have lack of laptops for remote staff needs. You don't have enough technology to support your staff. You do not have mandatory IT security training. You have a failure of proper and ongoing training, and you have no staff person dedicated to data security. I actually don't want to spend too much time on this because our last workshop was all about this topic. So if you missed it, it was on IT systems and cybersecurity. I include a link to the webinar on the next slide, and you can also find the recording of the webinar on our website. So someone from our team could also drop the Building for Growth link in the chat now, and along with the password. If you haven't seen our other workshops, they're all there. The real point I want to touch on here is just that protecting data is really important. You can quite literally lose your funding or expose the details of vulnerable participants by not having strong systems in place to protect your data. So with more and more people working remotely, and now I think hybrid is kind of the way of the future, don't wait until something bad happens to beef up your approach to training, tools, and checks. So first, just make sure you have mandatory training, not just at onboarding, but ongoing throughout the year. Second, make sure you have the right tools in place to protect your data, and then write policies on how to utilize these tools, right? So the tools themselves, if they're not utilized, aren't going to do anything. So for example, can staff share participant data in an email if they don't include their name? Or do they have to encrypt it? What is your policy around that? Do people know your policy? How about use of data on cell phones? What's your policy? Do you use unique IDs for your grantees? Does your donor database allow you to interact with the data? Third, implement checks and balances. Having training and tools in place is only effective if people are utilizing them correctly. And the only way to know this is to check. Okay, here are some resources on protecting your data. And again, that first YouTube link is a full workshop we did on that in our for this program. So do check that out. Our last mistake is you live on a data island. So signs your organization may be making this mistake is you do not have formal referral partnerships. You do not share your data. You do not have data sharing agreements in place. You're not part of a data sharing network or community. You work in silos. When you want to understand something new, you start collecting information on it. You don't know where to look to help you learn more, or you are unfamiliar with like-minded organizations in your region. Okay, so how to be stronger together? How do we address this challenge? More and more nonprofit organizations are collaborating to create lasting change, and funders are actually increasingly funding these types of collaborations as well. So collaborating with other organizations to share data and better understand the needs of your community is a win-win. Some tips to increase your data network and ultimately your impact include those listed here. So first, decrease organizational silos. Within your organization, how many content areas do you address? Rather than having department meetings, what would happen if you had content-specific meetings that were organization-wide? What would it look like to create professional development pods where people could sign up for a track of development and learn on a journey with their peers? If you are approaching an organization-wide goal, how does each department show up to advance that goal in collaboration with one another? What is their unique role in advancing the organizational goal? What information does each department have that could enrich your solution? Does there need to be a leader, or do you need a team? Secondly, collaborate with other organizations. We are seeing an increase in collaborations. I already said this could be like formal collaborations like mergers or development of management services organizations, or informal collaborations like wraparound services, or even peer learning communities like the one that we're in right now. Building for Growth is in fact a peer learning community. So we are in fact engaging in a collaborative effort right now. We are seeing this trend because if you're mindful about your approach, collaborations can amplify your impact. Funders, of course, are interested in funding collaborations, particularly multiple organization collaborations, because they see the impact on communities. In order to collaborate with other organizations, you need to be familiar with like-minded organizations in the sector and also in your geographic region. You need to truly know your own organizational identity and differentiating strength, like the unique value you bring to the collaboration. You need to engage the community in identifying needs. Another note on collaboration may just be like sharing knowledge. Do you sign up for newsletters of like-minded information to stay on top of the blogs and reports they are publishing? Is there an opportunity to have a quarterly call with other organizations on a central topic? On the next slide, I include La Piana created a resource called the Mergers and Alliances Toolkit. It's kind of for more formal collaborations, but I think it's a really useful toolkit for even informal collaborations. It looks at like steps to consider before you engage in a collaboration, things to keep in mind. So it's on the next slide. I think it's really helpful tool. I would encourage you to check that out. Third, tap into community data. There are so many data partnerships popping up and it just makes so much sense. So in Chicago, for instance, an organization called Thrive recently helped Chicago Public Schools share data with other community groups serving the same students. This wasn't possible until like a few years ago. So these kind of data partnerships, they're a new thing. They make so much sense, but it's taken us a while to get here. It's all unidentified data usually in these partnerships, but when multiple organizations pool their data in a shared or searchable platform, it's so much easier to navigate the red tape and to have access to information that will help organizations accomplish their goals. This type of data collection approach helps dismantle those informational silos in order to increase collective impact. So just do a quick search if you're unfamiliar for data partnerships in your area, or think about how you could collaborate with another organization, share data with them to better advance your mission. As hateful legislation continues to be proposed, our best defense for protecting and advancing human rights may very well be in like this stronger together approach. Lastly, do not reinvent the wheel. If you have a question about something, chances are at some point, someone else had a similar question. So avoid terms like never, rather use terms like under-researched, under-examined. Even if the question is a little different, start by doing an exhaustive search of what's out there before implementing any new data collection or outreach into your business. So learn from what's been done and then use that collective knowledge to inform the additional information that you seek to find. And here are some resources on collaborative data.